Richard C. Cook is our guest analyst for NASA, for the for the Carter White House. Worked in a lot of other areas, U.S. Treasury Department, on and on and on. Expert in monetary reform, talking about the collapse of the economy, how it's being done by design, bringing us into neo-serfdom or feudalism, a North Korean-style state. He had just got to the point of the central bank financiers bringing down Russia by publicly, the Bank of England and others, and Brooklyn, shipping in thousands of Brooklyners to bring down the czars, not for the utopic communism, but for a banker utopia of slaves. Please continue, Mr. Cook.
Well, and then you had over in the Americans during the subsequent decades, while the United States was being harnessed as the financiers, military enforcer for the world, there was actually a significant power struggle within the United States between the forces that wanted to have a strong nation, a strong national economy, and this was primarily the program of the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, but Roosevelt was very ambiguous about it, and he allowed the banking system to continue to function, and it was after World War II when the American economy began to decline through the tremendous deficits that were being run up during the Vietnam War, that the United States began to fall back into the control of the international financial world. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was sinking the United States deeper into debt. The problem at that time was made worse by very heavy federal expenditures under social programs, particularly Medicare and Medicaid. But when Nixon became president, his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, came up with a plan where Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC nations would gradually increase the price of oil. And the profits for that were going to be used for the oil-producing nations to buy debt from the U.S. Treasury. So in other words, this is what we were going to do with our deficit from that point on. It was going to be sold overseas to other countries, particularly the OPEC oil-producing nations. That's why over the decade of the 70s, by 1980, the cost of oil had been ratcheted up from $3.50 a barrel to $39.50 a barrel.
And that's really a global
program.
That's really a covert global tax.
It's a tax. It was a de facto tax on the economy, and the plan worked. The petrodollar and dollar hegemony were born, and the dollar at that point became the world's reserve currency. Now, the dollars could flood the world only because in 1971, the Nixon administration abandoned the dollar's gold peg as a basis for international currency exchange. Now, currencies could float freely in the world markets, and so you had a tremendous period of currency speculation and worldwide inflation. From this point on, the bankers were in control. The economies of the world were no longer based upon production. They were based on financial manipulation. It was also the beginning of the era of monetarism, where the Federal Reserve thought it could regulate the economy by raising and lowering interest rates. What that meant was the economy of America would go from a producing economy to a bubble economy.
And they now, we've got to break again. We've got to break again, sir. So now they've got reality out of the equation. They can flood everything with their fiat and get real assets. And the last little bit we've got will be taken by the nice men in black uniforms. It's all about monopoly of control. You're to have nothing but your Prozac. We'll be right back. Richard C. Cook, White House analyst, advisor, syndicated columnist, analyzing what's happening with the economy. Please continue with the history of the private owners of all of us who just so happen to be psychopathic eugenicists and say they want to get rid of us, and who happen to control our police. Please continue.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Let me just mention my email address again for people who want to write in with questions or support what we're doing. It's economicsanity@gmail.com.
Would you like in the hour we've got left later to take some phone calls?
I think we could do that, yeah.
Okay, 1-800-259-9231, 1-800-259-9231, or the local studio number, 512-646-5400. We'll do that, though, later. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I want to continue doing some of the historical background here and try to get to some of the solutions that we might want to take a look at for all of this. We talked about the 1971 milestone where the dollar peg to gold was removed, and that allowed the currencies of the world to float against each other and brought in this huge era of speculation. And it also allowed the petrodollar to come into being, where the OPEC nations and Saudi Arabia and the others now were going to purchase U.S. Treasury securities and run up the price of oil to pay for those. This plan was really the plan of the Secretary of State under Nixon, Henry Kissinger. And another thing that it did, it made the U.S. dependent on Middle Eastern oil and turned the U.S. into the power behind the financiers' ambition to dominate the region, particularly through working with the nation of Israel. So now the United States, which had liberated Europe from the Nazis, we also began to be the ones who were going to fight and die for the financiers in the Middle East. And, of course, the final conquest of Iraq starting in 2003 and the planned war against Iran are phases of that. Now, meanwhile, back here in the United States, through the financiers' control of the Federal Reserve System, the producing economy was wrecked through the Fed-induced recession of 1979 to 1983. Now, that's when Volcker raised interest rates to the highest in history to combat the inflation which the financiers themselves had caused through the oil price shocks. Then, when Clinton was elected president in 92, the U.S. producing economy, which had been devastated by the shutdown of the factories and the export of jobs under Reagan and the first Bush, well, the work of wrecking the economy was completed by Clinton's embrace of NAFTA, which has largely eliminated family farming in favor of financier-controlled agribusiness in North America, throughout U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And, of course, the deregulation of the financial industry, which had begun in a big way during the Reagan and Bush years, was accelerated under Clinton. Now, by this time, the only thing that was floating the U.S. economy were the bubbles. You had the merger-acquisition bubble of the 80s, and that ended in the George H.W. Bush recession that brought Clinton into the presidency in 92. Then during the 90s, you had the dot-com bubble that was fueled not by American savings, but by foreign investment. And it was the capital gains on these stock price inflations and counting trust funds like Social Security as part of budgetary assets in the federal budget that allowed Clinton to balance the federal budget during the last 3 years of his presidency. But it all ended, as we know, when the dot-com bubble burst in the crash of 2000 and 2001. And Americans lost in that crash $7 trillion of wealth, including the pension funds of hundreds of thousands of people. Now, after that came along the Bush bubbles, because Bush, as you know, did not attempt to rebuild the economy. What he did was cut income taxes to the highest tax brackets and allow Alan Greenspan to create the housing bubble, followed by the equity fund bubble, the commercial real estate bubble, the hedge fund bubble, and all of that is what now is coming to a head and is starting to deflate while ruining the economic viability of the nation. After this, the only bubbles are left are the ones that we're seeing so clearly out there right now. Those are the food and fuel bubbles. And these are the ones that when they go down are going to take the livelihood of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people with it.
And I would call those hyper-predatory bubbles.
That's correct. And that's all that's left because the producing economy can't support the nation anymore. There's nothing left, and these are the last bubbles.
This is the predatory system. This is the cannibalistic system. And that's what they've stated. All that's left is war, military cops, checkpoints, cameras. And I just can't believe this once great nation is just going to be, oh my God. But the people are waking up now like never before. I don't know if they're going to get away with it. I mean, this hellish thing they plan to set up.
Well, if we can, what I'd like to do is go through some of what I think are the solutions that we have to start working with. Because we've got to be...
Okay, solutions are great, and I want to take some time to talk about solutions. We did that yesterday with G. Edward Griffin. My issue here is that the establishment has electronic voting machines that engage in fraud in most of the country. We know that the government, the CIA, runs the big three electronic companies. We know they're ignoring. 91% want to control the borders. They say no. Gallup poll. 80-something% want to end the war. They say no, it never ends.